Discretion is advised. This is 10-Minute Murder.
(1960s) Newcastle upon Tyne, the withering, dying neighborhood of Scotswood, became the scene of extremes. A new age of renovation and industry had the council knocking down and rebuilding streets of old Victorian terrace houses, leaving rows of derelict, empty buildings as the home for some of Britain's poorest families. With nowhere to go, some of those families moved into the houses marked for demolition. Others became the playground for neighborhood children, left unattended for hours at a time as their parents struggled to make ends meet. One of those children was Mary Bell, or May, as she went by in the neighborhood. A dark-haired, blue-eyed 10-year-old girl was pretty and seemed sweet. She had a spark in her eye that spoke of her intelligence, but the warm and unassuming mask she wore hid a myriad of suffering. Elizabeth Bell was only 17 years old when she had her second child, Mary Bell, and by then Elizabeth was already living life on the edge. She was a sex worker who sometimes would leave her children for days on end to travel up to Glasgow and work. But that was just the tip of the iceberg when it came to what was really going on inside the Bell household. Relatives noticed that May would often end up injured after she'd spent time alone with her mother. A mother who, by some accounts, was rumored to suffer from Munchausen's by proxy. But maybe this case would have turned out differently if May had only suffered from a few bumps and bruises. But unfortunately, Elizabeth had made her feelings about May clear from the very start, and it only headed downhill from there. Accounts from the hospital staff say that when May was born, Elizabeth began shouting and screaming, refusing to hold her child and instead ordering staff to get that thing away from her. From then on, May was constantly in harm's way. Her mother reportedly once tried to kill her by making her overdose on sleep medication. Another time, relatives watched as Elizabeth, air quotes, accidentally dropped the infant May out of a first-story window. May was left permanently injured after that, with brain damage to her frontal lobe that may have affected her ability to make decisions and control her emotions. There is one more account of Elizabeth's attempts to get rid of May, and that was when she sold her child to a mentally ill woman on the other side of Newcastle. The woman had been unable to have children of her own and took up Elizabeth on her offer to buy May Bell. May was only reunited with her family because her older sister made the journey across Newcastle to go and get her back herself. When May was only 4 years old, Elizabeth found a new way of exploiting her youngest daughter. With her family constantly asking for Elizabeth to hand over care of May to them, Elizabeth chose to go in a different direction entirely, and that only involved more and more abuse. Elizabeth often brought clients home with her, and she began actively encouraging them to live out their sick fantasies with her 4-year-old daughter. May was tied up, blindfolded, and often forced to perform acts on her mother's clients, abuse that would continue well throughout the 1960s. When May was around 8 years old, classmates and teachers noted that her behavior became more aggressive and more violent. She'd switch from being a seemingly perfect and happy child one moment to attacking her classmates the next. The other children knew to be afraid whenever May went quiet and got what they later described as a cold, steely look in her eyes. May would then stare intently at one of the other children around her and eventually end up violently attacking them. May often went for the throat. She was caught numerous times trying to strangle the other children, and reportedly one time held down another girl and stuffed sand into her mouth. The only one who seemed exempt from May's attacks was an older girl and neighbor, Norma Joyce Bell. These girls were not related but had the same last name and a good few other things in common too. Norma was 12, but developmentally challenged, and she had a mental age of around 8 years old, making her a good friend for another girl who had a hard time fitting in at school. In May 1968, when May was 10 years old, a 3-year-old boy turned up in the neighborhood, dazed and confused and bleeding from a wound in his head. He claimed that he'd been out with May and Norma and had been playing on top of an old air raid shelter when one of the girls had pushed him. He'd fallen about 2 meters and split his head, and though they couldn't say exactly which one of the girls had pushed him, he wasn't the only child to make a complaint about them that day. Later that evening, 3 other families contacted the police to say that their children had been attacked by May and Norma. According to testimonies, including from May and Norma themselves, the children had all been playing in the sand pit when May decided she wanted to find out if someone could die from strangulation. She then began strangling one of the other girls until her face turned purple. Then she moved on to the second girl and did the same, and she did the same again when a third girl approached the sand pit to see what was going on. May denied everything, but Norma openly admitted what had happened. The police, not quite sure what to do when everyone involved in the attack was so young, gave both May and Norma a warning and moved on. A week later, and a day before May's 11th birthday, the authorities were called yet again when the body of a 4-year-old boy was discovered in one of the abandoned houses in Scotswood. 3 other local children had found his body while playing, and after hearing the news, a local workman rushed to the scene and attempted to resuscitate the boy. He was still performing CPR when first responders came, and someone else arrived shortly behind him. May and Norma appeared at the door to the bedroom where the 4-year-old boy was lying flat on his back, his arms stretched out above his head, foam and blood speckles around his mouth. The girls were quickly ushered from the room, only to run across to the neighbor's house and knock on the door. "One of your sister's bairns has just had an accident," they told Rita Finley. "We think it's Martin, but we can't tell because there's blood all over him." The boy was Martin Brown, and his autopsy revealed no certain cause of death. A day later, a local nursery was broken into and vandalized. The perpetrators left notes that read, quote, "I murder so that I may come back," and "We did murder Martin Brown." Investigators chalked it up to a childish but cruel prank. 2 days later, May and Norma showed up at the Brown household asking to see him. May specifically said that she wanted to see him in his coffin. The same summer, in 1968, the police were called out yet again to another horrific scene. The body of 3-year-old Brian Howe was discovered crudely hidden behind 2 cement blocks out in the slums. The last people to be seen with him alive were none other than May and Norma. He'd been strangled, his genitals partially mutilated. There were puncture marks on his legs, his hair had been cut in places, and a crude M had been carved into his stomach. During interviews, Norma seemed agitated and on edge. May was calm and collected. They told investigators that they'd been out playing with Brian that morning, but hadn't seen him since lunchtime. In a following interview, May claimed to have later seen Brian with another 8-year-old boy who had a pair of scissors with him, and she sealed her fate. The police had determined that the numerous puncture wounds on the boy's legs had come from a pair of scissors that had also been found at the scene, but they had not released that information just yet to the public. If May felt the need to include information about a pair of scissors to the police, they figured it was because she knew that scissors had been involved in the murder. A few days later, investigators received a call from Norma's family claiming that she was ready to confess. Norma then said that May had taken her out to Brian's body after May had already strangled him, then showed Norma how she'd killed the boy and where she'd hidden the pair of scissors and a razor blade that the investigators had previously missed. Both girls were then arrested. At the trial, the girls turned on each other, both claiming that the other one had actually been the one to kill both victims before the defense teams changed tracks and went into damage control. Norma's developmental issues and mental age became a huge factor. Her lawyers claimed that she was afraid of her violent friend and was easily led astray even though she was the older of the two girls. May's team said that May had tried to stop the attacks, but because Norma had been an older and bigger girl, there was nothing that she could do. May was also psychologically examined and was found to have a psychotic personality disorder. Her history of documented physical, psychological, and sexual abuse painted the picture of the troubled and disturbed life May had been living up until then, and it influenced her sentencing. May was imprisoned indefinitely for manslaughter charges, and Norma was released. May went from institution to institution until she was 23 years old, when she was released after spending over 11 years behind bars. That's 10-Minute Murder for today. Brief and bingeable true crime. I'm Joe, the host, and thank you so much for taking the time to listen to the podcast. If you're new, make sure you hit subscribe to 10-Minute Murder anywhere that you're listening to this podcast right now. And follow along on social media to see the pictures of what we talk about here on the podcast. If you've got a question, if you've got a case suggestion, or just something in general you want to tell me, you can do that by sending me an email, joe@10minutemurder.com. And speaking of, here's one of those emails. Hey, Joe. I just wanted to take a second to tell you how much I enjoy the podcast, especially as a neurodivergent person. The corny jokes and quips at the end also help. And then she goes on to tell me about a story that she'd like for me to cover. It looks very interesting. Anyway, thanks for the great podcast. I look forward to hearing the cases you research each week. And while I'm here, I'm curious about something. How do you keep your research and your everyday thoughts separate? If I binge too many true crime podcasts, which is another reason I like this one, only 10 minutes of suspense, I worry that someone is in the house, ready to bludgeon me to death at any time the dog lifts her head off the bed in the middle of the night. Really, how do you do it? That's Jen F. in Shamokin, Pennsylvania. Jen, first of all, thank you so much for taking the time to reach out and to also send that case idea for me. But how do I keep my everyday thoughts separate from the research that I do? Simple answer is I don't. I definitely try. I've documented it on this podcast before that I get nightmares. And the only way that I can really almost guarantee that doesn't happen when I've spent a lot of time either doing the podcast or research for the podcast is stand-up comedy. I listen to a lot of stand-up comedy on Spotify or on SiriusXM, or I'll put it on Netflix, a special that's on Netflix before I go to bed. And that usually will keep me out of that mental space as I'm falling asleep where I won't have a nightmare. And then aside from that, not outside of the nightmares, I'll just take breaks from researching true crime cases. I have to take breaks every now and then because I can't do it every single day because, that would put me in a really dark place if I even attempt to do that. So I don't attempt to do that. So I take breaks and I listen to stand-up comedy. That's the TLDR of that. Thanks again, Jen, for your email. If you've got an email that you want to send me, joe@10minutemurder.com. And that's going to do it. Another 10-Minute Murder podcast episode. I'll see you on the next one.